Happy Thursday, everyone. Jamie Henkel here, Learning and Inclusion Manager at PFLAG National. My pronouns are she and her. And so we have a lot of time for our conversation this week. I'm going to introduce Jean Marie Nevada and bring her in right away.
Hey, Henkel. How's it going?
Marie. Good. How was the wilderness?
The wilderness was good. I survived my big 3 days roughing it in a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom cabin in the woods, which I call roughing it.
Very proud. Hooray. Hooray.
Thanks. We will see you later, Jamie.
Yep.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at PFLAG National, and every Thursday we get together to talk about something related to current events. And this week we are actually talking queer LGBTQ people, and we have a really interesting article that was called Queer and Christian in Texas, Are They Always Conflicting Identities?, written by Stacy Fernández. And this week I'm really excited. Well, I'm excited every week, but I'm super excited this week to bring in one of my very best friends, the Reverend Mark Fowler, who is the CEO of the Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. Hello, Mark.
Hello, how are you?
I am doing great, and I am so happy to see your face.
It's good to see you too. I'm glad that you made it through your desert experience. That's fantastic.
I did. I'm a very, very rugged girl. We all know this now. I can survive. I built a fire and everything. Admittedly, it wasn't a fireplace. So we are here to talk about religious identities and LGBTQ people. And this article, I really enjoyed it because it actually profiled 3 different people who had very different approaches to how they were incorporating both their religious beliefs and their identity as people who identified somewhere in the queer space. So I wanted to ask you first about the article. When you read the article and when you read these examples of Paloma, Alonso, and Claudia, were there things in there that you related to? Were there things that seemed to resonate? Were there any things that came up that maybe you hadn't considered before?
Yeah, so I mean, I think particularly in Paloma's story, the whole idea of praying and wanting God to take her trans identity away from her, like that, I wasn't asking for my trans identity to be taken away, but I remember those prayers of, fix me, change me, make me new, and then nothing kind of happened. I was kind of like, okay, I guess that's an answer. And I really did resonate with that part of her story, that journey to inner acceptance and inner knowing, more than just inner acceptance. Like, what do you know fundamentally to be true about your personal relationship with whatever deity you worship or in communion with? So there was that. And I think the other thing that was interesting was, at Tanenbaum, we talk about religion not from a theological perspective often, but from this intersection of culture, belief, and practice as it relates to a person's religious identity. And they each talked about in different ways how the culture of the religious and spiritual communities, or for Alonso, the school community, like the culture of the community actually impacted how he was able to navigate that circumstance. And the culture within their churches impacted how welcomed they felt, or were they really seen in those communities. So we all kind of balanced that differently, and I saw that in their stories. And I think the thing that I had not thought about before was certainly being it seemed like from my reading of it, being in a different language from my own religious community, one that was very much driven by a culture that is not mine and an ethnic history that is not mine. So not knowing that I couldn't completely say that I know that experience because I don't have that experience. So just noting that there would be questions that I would want to ask them about their experience, just to see how it might be the same or different from my own.
I thought one of the most fascinating things, and you and I have talked about this a lot, was that none of them left religion. That was not actually part of the equation. And for a very long time, I always felt that was almost the default for a lot of queer people, that, I understand my identity, I'm not accepted, I'm out of here. either completely or going to another place. And certainly Paloma's story was an example of where she had found a more inclusive community. But I thought it was really fascinating that even in that case, we were talking about people who were not leaving. And so I'd be curious, and we didn't plan on asking this, but I know you can talk about this. One of the things that we have seen is this headline that we often talk about, that the number of people who are in the United States who are identifying as Christian is on the decline. The number of people who say I'm spiritual but not affiliated is increasing. But the number of people who are LGBT, it's actually the research says LGB, who identify as Christian actually has increased for the past few years. And do you think that, why do you think this is happening? Do you think it's because there are more inclusive spaces in faith communities, so more people are saying I can stay? Or do you think it's that more people are just forging their own way of doing this, in some ways in the way that Claudia in the story did?
My suspicion is that it's both of those, and I think that there probably is something for people reporting more and actually saying that I both identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, and I'm a member of this religious following, whatever that might be. And so I think it's a combination of all of those things. I also think that there's something interesting about um, the communities where people not are just not leaving, but are being welcomed. So I would say probably over the last 20 years, there have been, and I'm not talking about megachurches per se, but I think within various denominations, within Christianity and otherwise, there are more places that are actually making room for LGBTQ people and making public room, should I
Yeah.
say. So they because and I think that there's also some economics to it to a certain degree because there are but so many people you want to walk out the door.
Yep.
So I do think that that's a part of it because rent is rent or mortgage is mortgage. But I do think that that's part of it. I can't say whether it's more or less accepting, but I do think that we're in a season where more people are willing to publicly declare that they both are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, non-conforming, queer, and a person of faith of some delineation.
Right. Right. And I think that, well, this sort of gets into that second question, which is the whole article was based on this concept of conflicting identities. And I think that that in and of itself assumes a lot of things. It assumes that there must be a conflict between being a person of faith in most faith traditions. And we know there are some that are fully accepting from the get-go, but we know that's not typically the case for everybody. So this sort of assumed that there is by default going to be this conflict between a religious community or a religious identity and identities, of sexual orientation and gender identity. And I think that this kind of brings up the conversation that you and I have been having for a very long time, which is we actually need to lead the conversation in saying that that should not, in fact, be our default, that you shouldn't have to make this choice. And are you seeing more of this? Is this something that you think, this idea of that the conflict is not immediately the default position, is this actually changing in a significant way? And I'm going to throw this one out. Do you think it's at all generational?
Mm.
Mm.
So I think the first question is I don't know so much that I see a lot of change in this regard, but I also feel like there are more opportunities for people to marry publicly what they believe to be true of their faith walk as well as what the community says. So one of the things, if you notice, that's missing from the article, the three people interviewed talk about the inner conflict that they had.
Right.
And they speak about, from almost a third person perspective, about what the challenge was from the community that they were in. We don't have any first person accounts from the people in the community. And it would be very interesting to ask individuals, not just the person who's the leader of that religious community. So, what's your experience with Paloma? Because I wonder, like, who are the allies in those communities that may be quiet allies or upstanders, and we just don't hear them. We don't get to hear their voice because we're hearing from the leadership of the organization. So that's one piece. I do think that there's something I hesitate about the generational aspect because a very good friend of mine, Juan Battle, did some research several years ago on this whole idea of religious affiliation, particularly within the Black LGBTQ community. And what he saw was that you didn't see a lot of people leaving their community. They stayed. They were members of the community. Even if they were being talked about, they didn't leave. And you saw more from white LGBT people of a similar age moving from not just the church, but even the towns and the cities in which they live to move to more urban areas. So I would say that maybe generation is playing a part of it, but I think that there's a geography to it. And then there's kind of like this other piece in the background that is economic, because on one hand, you're talking to some people who have nowhere to go.
Yes. Yes.
So there's something about, this is my faith, this is my home,
Yeah.
this is my community, and where am I going to go? Even if I'm not fully accepted here, there are plenty of other places where I'm not accepted at all.
Exactly.
Right. And I do think that there's something to be said for the generational differences. There's a lot of talk about, the Pew information about millennials and Gen Zers who are more and more identifying as unaffiliated, but that doesn't mean they are without spirituality or spiritual activity, if you will. And so those people, as they develop relationships, get married, like so many of their straight counterparts, are looking for a place to be at home.
Yes. Yes. And I think there was a study that came out a few years ago. And I think your point about geography is really fascinating, because I was thinking about what has been accessible to me in terms of being a queer identified person who is also a person of faith. I have, for the most part, lived my life in major metropolitan areas where there was always an alternative for me. I didn't have to go to the Catholic Church where I was uncomfortable because there was a mass for somebody like me. That is not the case everywhere. But I was thinking about, there was a report that came out a few years ago that talked about, at the time it was looking at millennials who identified as evangelical, and those who had left had said that part of what bothered them was the treatment of other people. But I don't know, to your point, that was a significant enough amount of people, walking out the door that it actually would change it. But maybe it is those people who stay and whose attitudes shift slightly.
Absolutely.
So I want to talk about then what people should be. Hey, Jamie.
Hey.
Hello. I was asked to pop in. Some folks are having trouble hearing Reverend Fowler, and so can you use your outside voice and annoy those apartment neighbors in New York City for a little bit?
They won't be annoyed. They'll be used to it.
Cool. I just wanted to pop in. I will let you get to the next question.
Thank you, Jamie. We have no inside voice, Mark. None.
Yeah, I know, just the one in my head. So I will do a better job of speaking.
Projecting, as we do in restaurants when we feel that everyone should hear our conversation.
That is correct.
Yes. So the last question that we had actually got to exactly where we kind of just left off right there, which was about what people should do. So, we know we have this issue here. We know we have these challenges here. What do you think people should be doing in their faith communities now, particularly people who are not LGBTQ identified, to start signaling? I think, we can talk about how to change entire denominations, but I think, what's that everyday stuff that you think needs to be happening? How can those in the pews, so to speak, actually start demonstrating inclusion? So maybe people like Paloma, Alonso, and Claudia would have had a different experience.
So I think one thing, and I'm hoping that people can hear me, one thing that I think is really important is that for those people who are allies and parents and supporters, whatever your faith walk is, begin to know it more intimately. Because often people walk away on the suspicion of what they think somebody thinks about them, as opposed to what they actually know. And part of being an upstander in a religious or spiritual community is being more than driven by your emotion, but really be driven by the doctrine of what you say you believe and go deep into that learning. So that's one thing, because you can argue, theology with anyone, but when you've come to some understanding from your own reading, your own study, your own prayer, etc., then that's unlikely to be broken. So that's one thing. I also think it's important that you need to develop your own reading list around the role that religion plays and has played in oppression of people broadly writ, but certainly within the LGBT community. And one book that I would recommend, two books that came out this year that really look at the impact of white supremacy on Christianity and as well on the larger scale of religion. One is called White Christian Supremacy by Dr. Khyati Joshi, Joshi. And the subtitle of her book is The Illusion of Religious Equality.
What a great title.
Yeah, so when you kind of go back in and look at the laws that were created, et cetera, why women couldn't vote until 1920, et cetera, you begin to see a very clear network, and the experiences of lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgenders are interwoven into that story as well. The second book was written by Dr. Robert P. Jones, Robbie Jones, at Public Religion Research Institute. His book is called White Christian. No, his book is called. Hold on a second. Sitting right down the table. I get his two titles confused. His book is called White Too Long. And he goes into great detail talking about the impact of white supremacy on Christianity in the United States. So if you can imagine, if you could pull the two things out, if you could talk about supremacy as one dynamic and Christianity as another, and supremacy actually impacting the understanding and practice of Christianity, and begin to separate them out, then you begin to see a different theology that really is guided not by being supreme to others, but is guided by loving others.
Fascinating.
So those are two things. And then I think the third thing that I would recommend is that those places, spaces, stories that are evolving, as you find out about them, lift them up. I mean, in preparation for this, another article came up and I made a note of it. So Maury Turner is a person who was elected to the Oklahoma State Legislature. They are queer, Black Muslim, non-binary. They wear a hijab, and they are now serving in the state legislature that last year in 2019 refused to allow an imam to open the legislature's operations with a Muslim prayer.
Wow.
So if that could happen inside of a year, then we need to focus on those stories and set your Google alerts for stories that actually support what would be an inclusive religious and spiritual community for queer and LGBTQ people.
That is, I think that's fascinating. Ooh, we're getting an echo. I'm going to have to ask you to do something. Could you mute while I'm talking? This is ridiculous. This is the worst technology day ever. I know. I've had this dream of just being able to mute the world so the way I'm the only one able to talk. So I really love those things. And I have to admit to you, I would not have necessarily thought to look into the concept of white supremacy as the lens into which I approach this. And so I really have to thank you, because as usual, I always do learn something from you. It's true. It really is true. But the question I want to ask you is, we didn't cue this one up, but I think we're all kind of curious about it. You look at a lot of different change. You were looking at all different kinds of denominations, and you were looking at religious change in a number of different ways, not just the LGBTQ place. I mean, Tanenbaum does a whole lot of different kinds of work. A lot has happened in the past few years. Do you feel like religion is getting to be in a more inclusive space or a less inclusive one? And I'm specifically talking about Christianity here in the United States, because I think the last 4 years, and particularly the last year, has really forced people to look at religion a little bit differently because of what's happening around us. Do you feel, on balance, we are headed in a more inclusive direction? Or do you feel that people are kind of hunkering down in their own beliefs and we're creating more like these pods of communities? Yeah, I know that was a big question.
Yeah, so I'm gonna try and answer that.
Mm,
Um, I think the difficulty with answering the question is when we think that somehow we were inclusive
mm,
before 2015, and then we all of a sudden got restrictive, and then now all of a sudden with a new administration everything is going to be better and people are dancing in the streets singing "Can You Feel a Brand New Day?" So I feel like more of what's happening is that closer examinations of what people fundamentally believe to be true of both whatever God or deity they serve and the walking around in daily life is coming up for at least examination. I don't think that we are more or less inclusive because I don't think that we were pretty much that all that inclusive before. And if you will, this kind of mirrors the conversation around racial equity. Like there's not a, 1964 Civil Rights Act and everything didn't get resolved. It what happened for a lot of people is that they didn't make any public declarations about what they didn't like. They just went underground and started planning and putting money into making sure that there were people who were sitting in federal judgeships who would be able to issue verdicts on the issues of the day around equity. So I feel like we are probably in a more transparent time about what we say we believe than I could say that we are more inclusive. For our gala this year, we had a number of people who recorded messages for us, and one of them was a former honoree, Brian Lear from the Brian Lear Show on public radio. And one of the things that he talked about is he was talking about COVID and talking about that we were now we're kind of like we're social distancing from one another, and that before COVID we were distancing ourselves in our religious and spiritual community, and people were just kind of worshiping with who you worship with. So I think that all of these things kind of happening at the same time: Black Lives Matters movement, the Me Too movement, a fragile economy, COVID-19, all of these things are pointing to the infrastructure that we have in place, the systems that we have in place are not equipped to deal with the kind of equity we want to see in society. That would be how I would answer. And I do think that you religious and spiritual communities have a unique role to play in both admitting what they've done in the past and also us, and this is what we're doing at Tannenbaum, is also shining a light on those religious and spiritual communities that have been doing anti-bias, anti-racism work. It's built into the DNA of their theology, that kind of thing. So we just have to have a broader view, I think, for looking at all of these topics.
Thank you for the question. Thank you for answering the question that I absolutely did not prep you for. I want one more thing, because I know that for a lot of people, Tannenbaum is new to them. In a quick soundbite, could you please tell people about Tannenbaum? Because I feel like it is the most amazing reference point and organization to look at for really thoughtful analysis of things. So please tell people a little bit about Tannenbaum, because we have a couple of minutes.
Sure. So Tannenbaum, we are a secular, non-sectarian, not-for-profit. Our mission is to combat religious prejudice, promote justice, and build respect for religious difference. And we do that by working with individuals and institutions to issue transformation that would allow for the equity that we all want to experience. We have 4 program areas. We do work in education with schools and school systems, in the corporate space with global corporations, large not-for-profits. In the healthcare space, we provide training for medical practitioners and non-clinical staff on the ways in which patients make decisions based on their religious beliefs and practices. And we also support a network of religiously motivated peace actors. We call them peacemakers in action, who work in active conflict zones around the world, motivated by their faith to bring about peace.
Yay. Thank you so much. Oh, and thank you. Good. Jamie put up the website. I encourage, if you haven't ever been to their website, you really should check out Tanenbaum and get on the mailing list, because the articles that you get every week are just so good. So I'm going to ask Jamie if she will come back, because I saw we had a couple of comments out there and I want to make sure that they're getting read off for people. Hello, Hinkle. And you're still muted.
I am still muted. Now, one question that came up that is going to really illustrate how very little I know about this issue. Somebody was sort of made a comment that the emergent church movements that we're seeing right now are probably impacting this conversation about who stays and who doesn't. I had to Google emergent church movement because I didn't know what it was. But do you have anything that you'd say or speak to when it comes to that comment?
So I'd have to Google emergent church movements, because I'm not exactly sure what that is either. Do you want to say what that is, and then I can respond to it?
So it looks to me as if it is, conversations about that. It says the emerging church is a Christian Protestant movement of the late 20th and early 21st centuries that crosses a number of theological boundaries. Participants are variously described as Protestant, evangelical, post-evangelical, and so on.
Mm-hmm. If it is what I think it is, then I would say that there are any number of Christian denominations, including the emergent church movements, but we see a lot of movement within the Mormon church, a lot of, if you will, people creating almost other denominations within Mormonism. Certainly, we've seen it within Catholicism. So I would say that millennials, and not just millennials, but millennials are more actively looking for and creating spaces where their beliefs and their practice, their culture, belief, and practice are lining up. And they're not necessarily relying on existing systems and or churches or communities to feed them. They'll create what, if they don't have it, they'll create it.
And it looks like Sean made the comment, thank Jay Baker. So Reverend Jay Baker is we're big friend. PFLAG loves him, and he did a really amazing job. And he talks so publicly about his journey to becoming a true ally and what that looked like, and that it was not easy, and it was fraud, and it meant losing people, and it meant losing congregation, quite literally. But I think the lessons that come out of that space are so incredible, and they are. I think so many of them are lessons of and stories of journey. And I think that resonates with a lot of people. We probably have time, Jamie, for 1 or 2 more comments.
Yeah, I mean, the additional comments that I saw were a lot of people that were, having conversation about this conflict not really existing, that we don't need to reconcile our beliefs because it is just a part of who we are. That came up a number of times, that people were really sort of resonating with that comment and that idea that there's these 2 parts of me don't need to mesh up. They are just who I am. So I think with that, Jean Marie, we can probably turn it over to you to close this out.
Excellent. Well, Mark, thank you so much for being with us here today. We are going to definitely have more things to talk about. I'm positive of it. So I hope you will come back.
I absolutely will come back upon your command.
If only everyone said those things to me, the world would be so much better for me. Well, thank you, everybody. I actually need to take a second to apologize. So a colleague of mine brought something to my attention last week, and I wanted to make sure that we were talking about it. So at the end of every episode, you know that I have been putting up one of my masks and reminding everybody to wear a mask. And a colleague reminded me that when I am doing this and talking to people with a mask over my face, people who are reading lips can't read my lips. So that was really, I wasn't being very thoughtful, and I appreciate the person who brought this up to me. And I think that that's a good reminder for all of us as we are doing this work online and we are spending time together to make sure that if you are trying to behave in an accessible way, you are not inadvertently doing things like covering your mouth so people can't lip read. So for anyone who that might have affected, I apologize, and I promise we are trying to do better, but please keep letting us know how we can make things better. I want to remind everybody, as we do every single week, to run fast, laugh hard, and to most of all, be kind. And I will remind you now to please wear your mask. We will be back next week with another something to talk about. We are taking Thanksgiving week off, so get ready for that. But thank you so much. Once again, visit us at pflag.org to learn more, and have a great week, everybody.